Hey, this is Ihab. This is a video tutorial on how to use rendering layers in Maya using the rendering engine Arnold. This is going to be quick and brief as much as possible, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how we can set up rendering layers, how we include lights, and also how we practically use overrides. So what I have right now is this piece of animation. Let me go into the camera that I have set up with the resolution gate so I get to see exactly the framing, and hit play. So you can see here in this cute animation I have a moving car and I have moving bushes. However, the house that looks like a Monopoly hotel, the house and the ground, they don't move. And since I'm rendering 60 or 80 frames, then it would be ridiculous to render all of these frames including the house and the ground, because that's gonna take more time. But in the meantime, there is one challenge that we would be facing as we render those layers. There will be something that would be missed as we separate them, as we separate the car from the bushes, from the house and the ground. And that thing is going to be the shadow. So how do we actually get the shadow to show even though we separate these objects from each other? So let's go into setting up the rendering layers first. We click on this button and then going here. The first thing I'm gonna do is select the objects that are not moving. So that's gonna be the ground and the house. I'm gonna go into this button here and create a new layer, and I'm gonna name this non-animated. Inside this I'm going to create a collection, and that collection is gonna be geometry. Once I set the geometry, I select them and go and click add. To make sure that I have this rendering layer successfully containing only those two assets, I click on the eye, and that's it. If I go and click on this one, it's gonna show everything. So beyond the geometry, I need to also include in this layer lights. Create collection, lights. And I can have these lights to be including in by clicking on add. This is a super simplified example, so we might just be able to include the lights in here without any issues. However, in many other examples or in professional practice, you may be dealing with a lot of lights, and you want to have certain lights to be in a scene and certain not in, or not in a layer. So in that case we would need to have a specific layer organization for that. That's why it's a good practice to always practice having the lights in a separate layer. So now with these done, I'm gonna go into the other asset here that I want to be in a separate rendering layer, and that's going to be the bushes. So creating a new layer here, I'm gonna name this bushes, and then right mouse button, create collection, and then geo, and I'm gonna add the geometry in there, and then I'm gonna select the lights and right mouse button, create collection, lights, and then add. Okay, so just to confirm, there we are. We have the lights and we have the bushes. Now the next step is going and adding the car. For some reason this keeps kind of demanding multiple clicks on me just to kind of be activated. It might be just the computer processing. Anyways, so creating a new layer here, and that's gonna be car, right mouse button, create collection, geo, then add, and then creating a new collection for the lights. Add. So now, right now, I have this, and that. So if I were to render these results, I'm going to open the Arnold renderer. I have the house and the ground and the lights and the shadows, but here I have only these. I don't have their shadows, and it might be the case where like they're kind of not showing here, but you can see from the corners we still are supposed to see their shadows. So their shadow is really important to be included as well. And the same problem I have is with the car. I do have the car on that layer, but I do not have the shadow. How do I get the shadow to be involved in there? And that's where we use the rendering overrides. The override, by definition, is to have an alteration to something that is kind of set up as default. And that alteration is going to be applied to only one aspect, meaning that I want all the layers to be treated the same way. But when it comes to separating these objects, I still want the same resolution, the same attributes, the same materials and lighting and whatsoever. But just one little thing that I want to change when it comes to a layer like this or a layer like this is to have their shadows with them. And the override is going to allow me to make a little change that applies to only one specific or two specific layers. So that is the definition of overrides. In other words, overrides are like, let's say the rule is to drive according to the traffic lights, right? And then something happens and a fire truck drives behind you, and even though it's kind of like the traffic light is red, but the fire truck needs you to move. So what overrides the law is when you're actually crossing the traffic light for the purpose, or maybe just barely crossing it, or maybe just moving on the side just to make way for the fire truck, and that is not necessarily an illegal thing. It's not actually an illegal thing because you're doing it specifically and primarily and only for the fire truck. So that is an override of the traffic law, right? But in any other case, you cannot cross the traffic light or kind of do any movement other than this, just staying for the traffic light. So that's what we do when it comes to override. So what I want to do now is to make an override that takes this ground. I'm just gonna stop the rendering here because it's processing. I'm gonna take this ground and add it into the car rendering layer and give that ground an override material, just so it would be applied specifically on this layer, so I would be able to get the shadow. So I'm going to keep this frame on, and I'm going to go into the layer here, say create collection. So pretty much like the car and the car geometry and the lights, I'm going to name this ground with shadow, and in it I'm going to add this ground. Okay, so if I go and select this result right now, click on play rendering, I'm getting the car, the shadow, and the ground. The problem with that is that if I were to assemble this render on top of this, or to show you better, on top of these, then that green or that yellow ground is going to be on top of everything else, and it's going to just ruin them. All I need is just the shadow that comes along with the car. So here's how I do it. I go into the car rendering layer, I go into the ground that was added, right mouse button, and then create shader override. And then I'm going to call this shadow catcher. Shadow catcher, by definition, or the terminology shadow catcher that is used in multiple software, is a material or an object that only exists to capture a shadow or to keep a shadow floating. One thing you notice is that right after you create an override, there is around the eye here, there's this red kind of contour or frame, and that is your indication that there is a layer override going on. Okay, now I go into the shader override, and I'm just gonna save this just in case, because it's extremely important to be careful when you have the rendering view open and it's rendering right away. The changes that we might make, especially when it involves adding new nodes and whatsoever and attributes, it may crash oftentimes, and especially if you're familiar with Maya, it's a very familiar thing. Anyways, so shader override, and then I go here and I want to look into a shadow matte. So it's gonna be in the Arnold, and then you can sort of scroll and waste your time, or you can just go into shadow matte, which is pretty much the one I had before, but I wanted to make sure that you do the search here. And also keep in mind that in the future, if you have anything in the search box here, you need to clear it later on, or sometimes it just shows you very few options. Just always make sure that you have the box here either cleaned out from any search words, or make sure that it has, if it does have some words, then it's the things that you need. Okay, so anyways, shadow matte, AI for Arnold, AI shadow matte. There you go. Now I have this shadow, and now if I render this out, it's going to be on top of the material. Okay, and one thing you'll notice here is that if you go into this button here, in some cases you don't really get to see the shadow. In many cases it's sort of you're looking for the shadow but you don't see it, but in this case this is kind of displaying the shadow for me. But if you had the shadow and you can't be sure that there is a shadow, then you can look into the alpha, and it's gonna show you in white the pixels that are available. So if you do see the car silhouette and the shadow, that means you do have the shadow in there. Okay, anyways, so with that, let me do also a similar override for the bushes. I'm gonna select on the ground and then go into the bushes, right mouse button, create collection, ground with shadow, then add, right mouse button, create shader override, click AI shadow matte, and then when I go and click on render, I should be able to get the shadows. Anyways, so now it's time to go into rendering these scenes. The first thing you need to do is to make sure that you have your scene set up, meaning that you go into file and then project window, and then you kind of set up all the basically clicking new and then create a folder and whatsoever. But for me, I already have that all set up, so I'm gonna name this rendering layer 3, change it to 4, ready for rendering. And then with that, I'm gonna go into these buttons here. So anything that is highlighted, that means it's going to be rendered. So for this one, I don't want it to be rendered because it's just one still. Instead, I can just go and go to the Arnold render, and then select on this, and this is gonna be the background for me. And once it shows me the time here, I know that the rendering is already processed. So I'm gonna go File and then Save Image, and I'm gonna create a new folder, Rendering Sequence, and in there I'm gonna name this Ground or Background if you must. And I'm going to use that image as the background. And since I have that separate, you might have some little animation here, so you can go back and render it later on. But all I care about is this one, and that's why these are the ones highlighted. So for that reason, I should be ready to go and render out. So if I go into the rendering layers, I'm just going to go and explain all of these steps here. So this is the name of the rendered image. This is the format. I'm going to go with JPEG, but for advanced rendering, you need to go into EXR, which has the AOVs or render passes to enhance your rendering quality. And then I'm going to go, you always want to avoid, unless you really have a strong reason, you always want to avoid name.extension.number. Multiple dots is just gonna ruin everything in many software. So always stick to name number.extension or name underscore number.extension. And then I would go into the number from 1 to 80, and then I would go into which camera that needs to be rendering this sequence, and I'm gonna stick with this low resolution, but you can always change these things from here. Hit close, go into rendering, and then I would go into render. When you click on batch render, it's really important that before you do that, you always go and check and make sure that you already have set up your project, because if you haven't set up your project, then it's just gonna go the renders you would never know where they're going, and it could get really messy. So I'm gonna call this drifting car. Okay, and that's gonna be it. The frame padding is how many zeros we have or how many digits. So if the more padding you have, you can see the name of the rendering appearing here. So I'm gonna stick to 3. Alright, so before I get into the very final step, which is this button here, I want to mention 2 things that are really important, and without them things may get messed up. If I go into the rendering layers, remember that this is gonna be the ground, so therefore I only need to render it only once. So I can just render it locally, so I don't really need it in here. The other thing is, while these 2 are selected or highlighted for rendering, I need to dehighlight this or unselect this, just to make sure that the main scene is not rendered. Otherwise it defies the purpose of using rendering layers, right? The other thing I want to mention is that I would say stick to the EXR instead of JPEG, because in the case where we have glass, and in the case where we have shadows, and you know, having this object on top of the background, you don't want it to come up with a white background or kind of white pixels around it. So that's why you want to stick to EXR, something that carries alpha channel with it. Okay, and once you're done, you are going to go into the render and then batch render, and then once you click batch render, it would start the rendering process here as it shows you, and then at the very end it shows you the rendering completed. And beyond this final step, one thing you need to know is that if you accidentally missed something when you realize that you need to stop the rendering, closing Maya wouldn't do it most likely. It's gonna keep rendering, and then you just waste a lot of time and whatsoever. So the best way is you go to render and then cancel batch render. And that's how you stop the batch rendering. Alright, I hope this helps.